The church is one. Her unity flows by necessity from the oneness of God. That's how Alexei Khomiakov, a lay theologian, begins his essay, The Church is One, in 1844. It's a small essay, only 20 or so pages. You could Google it right now and find a copy and read it in 20 minutes or so. But it's had a disproportionate impact despite the fact that very few people in the English world know of it. Very few would read it in a seminary classroom. So what we're going to do is explore the ideas in the church as one, explore how they came about and why I think they've had such a great impact, why I think the church as one should be essential reading in the ecclesiology class, in the theology program. But really, we're going to be looking at the question of how should we think about unity and division and harmony when we think about the world in light of the Trinitarian God. You know, you can't really go a couple of days if you read the news or listen to commentary at all without people talking about how divided the world is. The world is divided. Wouldn't it be better if we were just a little bit less divided? But what is there a value in division? If the truth is what's eternal and unchanging, if there is but one truth, how much disagreement should there be in the world? What should we expect in terms of disagreement? How does the church think about that in a Trinitarian sense? That's what we're going to be looking at today. But we're going to actually begin with a question of language and culture. And to use that, I'm going to begin with a book by a theologian I have a great respect for by the name of Lamin Sanneh. Now, Sanneh was born in the Gambia in 1942 to a Muslim family, and he converted to Catholicism in the 60s. He studied Islamic history in the UK and in Lebanon, and he eventually ended up teaching mainly missions, but theology also. He taught in Nigeria, he taught in England, and he mainly taught, though, in Harvard and in Yale. And he wrote what I consider a magisterial work on the subject called Translating the Message. Now, Sanneh asks a particular question. So I have in the corner this verse from Paul. Paul says, "Follow my example as I followed the example of Christ." What exactly does it mean for us to follow the example of Paul? For instance, if Paul wore a tunic, does that mean for me to follow the example of Paul, I have to wear a tunic? Christ, after all, probably wore a tunic also. If Paul spoke Greek and Hebrew, do I have to speak Greek and Hebrew? If Paul maybe followed a certain dietary customs, do I need to follow those dietary customs? Do I need to think like Paul in order to follow the example of Christ? What if I think like a modern person and not like a pre-modern Jewish person from the Hellenistic world? Now, you might say, well, those are all really silly questions because all those things you mentioned are just cultural things. They aren't the essence of the message. And this is exactly the question that Sanneh picks up in this book, Translating the Message. How do we determine what portion of what we conceive of what it means to be Christian is essential to the message, and how much of it is just the vehicle through which the message comes? So, for instance, when a missionary comes, if he comes wearing a suit and he goes to a tribe in Africa, do they need to wear suits in order to be Christian? Well, you might say no, but what if the missionary is married to one wife and the tribal chief is married to many? He's a polygamist. He's married to multiple wives. How would you decide that they don't need to wear a suit in order to be a Christian, but they would need to be monogamous? And another question that Sanneh is asking is, how much can you change the form of the message without changing the message itself? Can you worship? How much can you worship differently or pray differently? What can you do it in a different language? How much can you change the vehicle in which the Christian message comes without changing the message itself? And how do you determine what is following the message and what is following merely the cultural means by which the message comes from one place to another? And Sanneh notes that there are two ways that you could really think about this. One, he says, is to make the missionary culture the inseparable carrier of the message. This we might call mission by diffusion. By it, a religion expands from its initial cultural base and is implanted in other societies primarily as a matter of cultural identity. And Islam, he notes, remember he grew up being a Muslim, with which Christianity shares a strong missionary tradition, exemplifies this mode of mission. It carries with it certain inalienable cultural assumptions, such as the indispensability of the Arabic heritage in scripture, law, and religion. So Sane notes, for instance, how you can't really have the Quran in any language, but in Arabic you can translate the Quran, but it is a sort of copy of a copy. It's a lesser version of the Quran. An interesting version of this sort of missions by diffusion I find in the Spanish word for hopefully, ojalá, is rooted in the Arabic word inshallah, if God wills, because Arabic and Arabic cultures and Middle Eastern culture in many ways came with the Muslim message, with the Muslim expansion, with their missionary efforts, because, Sane argues, it spread its religion by means of cultural diffusion. Now, Sane says the Christian way of doing mission work has been different. He says the other way is to make the recipient culture the true and final locus of the proclamation, so that the religion arrives without the presumption of cultural rejection. This we might call mission by translation. Mission as translation is the vintage mark of Christianity, is what he argues in the book. And he chooses translation because he's very interested in how Christian tradition has chosen to translate the scriptures and to not consider those translations to be less than the originals. So, for instance, while professional theologians do learn Greek and Hebrew, and there's value in that, they should never tell you that reading the Bible in English is less than reading it in Greek. And in fact, the Christian missionaries have been a part of not just translating scriptures, but creating written languages all the way back to the 4th century, when the early monks in the lower regions of Egypt didn't invent the Coptic language, but helped invent a written form of the Coptic language in order to spread the gospel within the villages in the deserts of Egypt. Christianity has translated its message and put a lot of effort into creating new languages to do so, creating new written languages. So Sane says the language question lay at the very heart of the mission of Christianity and served to underpin the world of pluralism that came into being in the church. By that he means that very early you have a Jewish church and you have a Greek church, but you have a Syriac church and an Armenian church and a Coptic church and a Gothic church. All that very early on in the Christian expansion, the missionary efforts brings with it a cultural pluralism. There is not, even though Greek is very central in the early Christian history, there is not a definitive worldwide accepted Christian language or Christian culture. The spread of the religion thus turned on the revitalization of the immediate cultural setting. This gave Christianity an eclectic appearance with its elaborate and varied adoption of disparate sources. And so what Sane sort of says is that we can think of the different cultures that Christianity has grown up in as soils. So an example I would think of is that you can take a type of grape. If you want to make wine, you can take a grape, but the same grape will grow and have a different flavor in different soils. This is why you might buy bottles of wine from different vineyards, because the soil which that same grape has grown up in actually produces a different flavor profile. And Sane says essentially that the Christian way of missionary is not to transport the soil from the original to someplace else, but to grow the message of the gospel in different soils. But what's come from that is a certain eclecticism, that there's a diversity of views because of Christians' insistence on translating the message. That, he says, I suggest, was the genius of the religion, the ability to adopt each culture as its natural destination, as a necessity of its life. Christianity sought indigenous coefficients, and finding them, flourished by them, so that both the borrower and borrowed were transformed in a common direction. Now, there's a tension in this, though, because if you look at the history of missions, my reading is it takes about 2 centuries for this process to work. In other words, that Christianity is planted into new soils, and at first they're resistance, the missionaries are killed. Eventually, you often have a sort of formal adoption of the religion by maybe a monarch. You certainly see this in the past. And then even after that happens, you have about 2 centuries of syncretism where the truth of the message of the gospel grows in the soil of a different religion, in a sense, and it comes in conflicts, and it has to revise that thing. So you have centuries of sort of a Christianity growing within a new context, and then what emerges is recognizably Christianity, but it has a different flavor than you might have if it grown in a different soil. In other words, Christianity engulfs real life. It is not just simply a message that comes from the stars, comes from heaven down to us. It embraces and it grows within real life. Sasane says, it cannot be overstressed that this tension is inevitable in Christianity. The vernacular strength of the religion would pull away from the force of the center. Okay, so he's saying we need institutions. Who sends the missionaries? The institutions, the center, send the missionaries. However, Christianity is embroiled in this profound tension, confidently affirming God in the channels of living experience, and just as confidently rejecting these as identical with God. So, the gospel accepts the culture which it is planted in, but does not accept it as it is. It accepts it in order to transform it. And that is true for all the cultures which it has grown in. And that it was even true in the Jewish culture in which the church initially set up. It accepts the world of the Jewish world of the Old Testament, but it did not accept it without transforming it to some degree. Jesus does transform the Jewish world into which the gospel was initially planted. God is within us, he says, and yet God is beyond us. God is among us, but God is also against us. The center seems irrevocably fixed, not in an institution, but in Jesus Christ and him crucified, only to appear in the form of a kingdom about whose precise coming we remain in foreordained ignorance. Now, how did this play out in Russia, the story that we're telling today? Now, the gospel originally came to the Slavs through the work of St. Methodius and St. Cyril. They came from Constantinople and they went to the land of the Slavs. Now, the origin of the Slavs lies in mystery. A great many academics have spent their life trying to figure out. The best we can figure out is that there is a great eastward or a great westward movement of Germanic tribes in the first half of the first millennia. So these include things like the Vandals and the Goths, the tribes that would eventually settle in places like Germany and France and also into England. That they came probably from Asia. They ended up settling for a while in Eastern Europe, and then they made their way down. They sacked Rome along the way, and they settled across Europe. And so one of the first expansions of the Western Church was in contact with these Germanic tribes. After them came Slavic tribes. We don't know exactly where they came from, but we assume they probably came from a similar place. They came from Asia, and they settled in Eastern Europe where the Germanic tribes had been before they migrated to the West. And so around 900, particularly around 890, in the area of what we now call Eastern Europe, there were these Slavic tribes. So they're living at the border of the Western Christian kingdoms and the Eastern Roman Empire. And so from Constantinople goes St. Methodius and St. Cyril in order to serve as missionaries among the Slavs. Now you might recognize the name of Cyril from the Cyrillic alphabet. That's the alphabet with the funny characters that Russian and Ukrainian and a couple of other languages, Slavic languages, are written in. And that's because Methodius and Cyril created a written language for the Slavic people. And they did that so they could translate the scriptures into what they called Old Church Slavonic, which is the Proto-Slavic language, not the spoken one, but the written form, and really which around the various Slavic identities would begin to form. And so we're going to have in the case of Russia and Russian theology a case study in translatability and how the words which were chosen and the imagery that which were chosen is planted in a new soil and something's going to happen. Now, Sane talks about this. He says, among the Slavic people, the church took root in the vernacular soil stimulated by the translation enterprise. In the struggle of the Slavonic people for a truly vernacular church, then, we are brought to the center of Christianity as a vernacular movement. In spite of centralizing pressure on the Slavic Christians, despite of the pressure from the Byzantine roots which evangelized them, the church took on a vernacular aspect which translation invigorated. The Slavic language formed the basis of missionary work and became its chief instrument. Now, how did this work out? We're going to jump forward in our history about 30 years or so to the revival of the Varangians. We don't know exactly where they came from. Probably they were Norse coming from Sweden and Norway. So we assume it's probably from Sweden. These Norse people arrived and they began sailing the rivers in order to make their way to Constantinople. They formed trading posts around the way, particularly Kiev in the south, in the Great Plains, what we now know as Ukraine, and in the north, in what we know as Russia, Novgorod. But a great number of other trading posts. While they were there, they began mixing with the Slavic people, and a distinct people called the Rus emerged from this. And we're going to fast forward a little bit as the Rus began to sort of formulate as a people, a new sort of version of the Slavic people with their roots in this migration from the Varangians. They began to form their own language, and then we get to Saint Vladimir, or Prince Vladimir, who united the Rus people in Kiev at the end of the 10th century. Now, this story is told from an 11th century document called the Primary Chronicle, which was written by a monk. And so it tells the story, we don't know how accurately, but it tells the story of the conversion of the Rus. So he starts by talking about Vladimir. He says, when Vladimir began to reign alone in Kiev, he set up idols on the hills outside the castle with the hall. The people sacrificed to them, calling them gods, and brought their sons and their daughters to sacrifice them to the devils. They desecrated the earth with their offerings, and the land of Rus and the hills were defiled with blood. But our gracious God desires not the death of sinners, and upon this hill now stands a church dedicated to St. Basil, as we shall later narrate. So how did this come about? If you look at this little map here, you will see that the Rus are sort of at the borderlands between a number of other people. To the east and to the west, you have the Bulgars. The Bulgars split into what are called the Volga Bulgars on the east, and then in Bulgaria, the other Bulgar group. The Bulgars were Muslim. They were a Muslim group for a while. They aren't anymore, but they were then. You have to the southeast the Khazars, which were a nomadic people, which had a large Jewish influence. You have the Germanic tribes to the northwest, and then you have the Byzantine Greeks to the south. And so the Rus are situated between these people, and as good pagans, they came into religious conflict with the people around them, and these people started sending emissaries to them, trying to convince Vladimir to adopt their religion. And so what he decides to do is to send out emissaries to each of these people to decide which of their religion is best. And so they come back and they said, we journeyed among the Bulgars. We beheld how they worship in their temple called a mosque, while they stand ungirt. The Bulgar bows, sits down, looks hither and thither like one possessed, and there is no happiness among them, but instead only sorrow and a dreadful stench. Their religion is not good. Then we went among the Germans, and we saw them performing many ceremonies in their temples, but we beheld no glory there. But then we went to Greece, and the Greeks led us to the edifices where they worship their god. They go to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, the first of the great cathedrals, which was built around 520 and in the early parts of the 6th century. And for on earth, they say, there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men. And their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations, for we cannot forget that beauty. Vladimir there inquired whether they should all accept baptism, and they replied that the decision rested with him. And so, in 988, Prince Vladimir becomes Saint Vladimir. Eventually, he's baptized by a representative from Constantinople. And from then on, for the next several hundred years, the religious leader of the Rus people would be the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus. He was almost always a Greek that was appointed by Constantinople, and they would send them to lead the Rus people as an extension of the Byzantine Christianity. However, they did not worship in Greek. They used the Old Slavonic Bible, and they did their rites in Old Church Slavonic. And this is going to pay dividends later on in our story. Now, one of the central features of this story is the encounter with the Hagia Sophia, which was the first cathedral, or not the first cathedral, but really our first instance of a cathedral as we imagine them, dedicated to holy wisdom. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, and this is coming from the Greek translation of the Old Testament for Proverbs, when it says, "By wisdom you laid the foundations of the world." And in Byzantine theology, this has almost always been interpreted as a reference to Christ the Logos, as the wisdom of God, and they're doing that in collaboration with Paul. So on the left, you have an artist's rendition of the Hagia Sophia before it became a mosque, and so the minarets were added. You can see this amazing dome in the middle. It's an immense structure, and it's covered in the inside in mosaics and icons. The one we have here is one that was almost certainly in one of the naves when the emissaries came from Vladimir, and it shows on the left Emperor Justinian, who's holding a model of the Hagia Sophia, and on the right you have a modern representative of the Byzantine Empire who's holding the city of Constantinople, and in the middle you have Christ being held by Mary, his mother. And this is sort of represents a very Byzantine idea, the idea of the Symphonia. And this was actually laid down by Justinian, the guy on the left there, who was the first emperor in the 6th century who took Roman law and synthesized it with Christian ethics. So the ancient idea was essentially that virtuous people thrive. If you want to thrive, then you need to make your people virtuous. Well, of course, the idea is, what does it mean to be virtuous? And so you had different legal systems with different ideas of what virtue would be. So, for instance, Sparta and Athens might have different ideas of what it meant to be virtuous, and they would try to act them out because the idea was that if you were virtuous, you would thrive. And so Justinian takes this idea and he lays out the idea of the Symphonia, that the church has the responsibility to teach what is virtuous to the state, and the state has the responsibility to work in concert, in harmony, in symphony with the church to mandate that the people are virtuous as much as they can. Now, this has taken on a bit of a different flavor by the time we get to the 10th century. And we have a great example of this in the prequels to Star Wars, where you have the Jedi, who are the religious branch of the Republic, and then you have the Senate, who is the political branch, and the two are supposed to work together in order to advance the aims of the either. But the story of the prequels, which I doubt Lucas knew he was trying to tell about the downfall of the Byzantine Empire, but he was, shows that, unfortunately, it's very easy for the religious branch of the symphony to be corrupted by the power of the political branch. And so that there's a real problem, let's say, that emerged in the idea of Symphonia, and that there was a constant problem with corruption within the Byzantine church. And this, by the time you get to the 10th century, the idea of the Symphonia is very much an idea that the expansion of the kingdom of God is de facto the same as an expansion of the Byzantine Empire. So this is how a book on the religious factor in Russian foreign policy has a really interesting section on Symphonia. And the author says, the empire was considered the earthly image of the heavenly kingdom. Okay, so essentially you have a mirror between heaven and earth. And so in heaven, all things are gathered together under one. And so, of course, the empire on earth, their job is to gather all things together under one. And the hierarchy, which you have in Byzantine society, corresponds to the cosmic hierarchy. God, emperor in cooperation with the patriarch, and then believers. Okay, so what's happening? At the middle, the emperor and the patriarch working together form the bridge between God and the people. Evangelization was equivalent to the expansion of Constantinople. Widening the influence of the empire was seen in Byzantium in terms of the realization of God's plan, tightly connected with human salvation. This, I would say, is a symphonic understanding of the goal of the way that you know the kingdom of God is advancing. Let's say the way you know the church is on the realm, on the path of truth, is through the expansion of the Byzantine Empire in this case. Now, we're going to see a tension be introduced almost immediately with this, in that Vladimir is entranced, as you can tell by the story, with the beauty of Hagia Sophia. And so he immediately goes, not immediately, but very quickly goes and begins construction of his own Hagia Sophia, the cathedral in Kiev, which is dedicated to Holy Sophia. And now, if we just compare these two pictures, you'll notice that there's obviously some resonance between the two, but he has not just made a copy of Hagia Sophia in Kiev. He has taken the inspiration of Hagia Sophia, and he has introduced very particularly Russian or Slavic architecture styles. There's a lot more wood, for instance. That this is not just a copy, it is an inspiration that is planted in a new soil. And if you compare this particular icon to Holy Sophia, which you have in the Kiev Sophia Cathedral, to the one which we saw in the Hagia Sophia, you see some of the same elements, but this is not the vision of Symphonia, the vision of Christ administering the kingdom through the church and the state, which you saw in this other icon. This is a very different sort of picture. You see the Father and the Holy Spirit coming down upon Christ and Mary, who are in this gazebo upon which it says, "Wisdom builds her house." So this is clearly a reference to Proverbs. And you have all of these sevens. You have 7 steps, which have 7 virtues. You have 7 Old Testament prophets, including Moses. You have the 7 pillars, which probably is a reference to 7 churches. This is a very diffuse image this is a different image of what it looks like for Christ to rule on earth. It's not a clear image, but it's clearly different, let's say, at this point. Right after the Kiev Cathedral was built, we have a second Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia Cathedral, built in Novgorod. And we have another icon to Sophia, which is again quite different from the one which we saw in the Hagia Sophia. Again, the one in the Hagia Sophia wasn't specifically icons to Sophia, where these two were specifically made to Sophia. This is an idea which sort of is going to be in contrast to the idea of Symphonia. So the idea of Symphonia, God reigns on earth by the sort of church and state acting in concordance in order to spread heaven upon earth. This is an idea which is going to be known as Sophianicity, which is going to be a major topic of Russian Orthodox theology within the 20th century. This is what Nicholas Zernov, how he describes it. This is a classic book on Russian religious history in the 20th century. He says, the fundamental conviction of the Russian religious mind is the recognition of the potential holiness of matter, the unity and sacredness of the entire creation, and man's call to participate in the divine plan for its ultimate transfiguration. These ideas can be grouped under the name of Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, the vision of which has never faded out of the long evolution of Russian Christianity. Now, why is it important, the conviction about the holiness of matter? And we're going to see this as our story progresses. It is very convenient to not believe in the holiness of things if you want to change it. Right? If you want, so for instance, if you think that the particular garb of the missionary is holy, that there's something particularly holy about the suit, let's say, of the missionary, or the jeans and polo of the missionary, then you won't change it, right? But if there's something holy about it, then it's not so easily changed. And so it's very important, if you want to change things, if you want to deconstruct them, to rid them of any spiritual content, of any holiness, because then you can trample on them much more easily. This deviation from the long-established tradition of the imperial city required originality and independence of thought, said Zernov, in the new converts, and indicated an interpretation of Christianity which was distinct from the Byzantine prototype. This was a new soil. The icons of the Holy Wisdom, which we just looked at, further expounded the same belief that the cosmos did not merely reflect the heavenly glory, didn't merely reflect, it was not a reflection to be brought into continuity with the image, but it had a potential personality and therefore could participate in the designs of the triune maker. That the world is not merely a thing to be brought into the image of heaven, but the world participates in the transformation into the kingdom of heaven. Matter was conceived as spirit-bearing, as a living and responsive partner in the great drama of the fall and redemption. Humanity exemplified this close organic interplay between spirit and flesh. In other words, to understand what the world is and what it means for the world to bear the Spirit of God, you had to understand what humans were. And to understand what humans were, you had to understand, he says, the joys and pains of his earthly existence were occasioned by the unity and divergency between the spiritual and physical elements of their being. Despiritualized, the matter of his body dissolves into its primary element. His distant body spirit loses its power to operate in the universe, and both spirit and matter dispensable for the fulfillment of the ultimate aims of the universe, which is revealed in Holy Wisdom. The growth of the Russian culture has been stimulated by attempts to find the answer to the mystery of man's complex nature and his place in cosmic life. The Russian language reflects absorption in the same problem. Russian art and literature follow the same lines. So Russian history, though, takes a significant turn in the year 1240, in the middle of the 13th century, when the Mongols come out of Asia and they conquer the entirety of the Rus kingdom. Now, Crimea and parts of the Ukraine are soon after this become part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, which was a Catholic empire. And so this is where the history of sort of Ukraine and Russia diverged for a bit. We also begin to see the rise of Moscow. The city of Moscow positions itself as they make a deal with the Mongols to be the administrator of Mongolian way of life within these now the conquered Russian principalities. And so we see the rise of Moscow, the sort of transfer of the center of Rus from Kiev to Moscow during this time. And the Russian people sit under this Tartar yoke for about 250 years. And they're very isolated from all the rest of the world. And they essentially, the link with Byzantium is broken, and they also have very little contact with the West. Now, the rumblings of this begin to change at the end of the 1600s. Now, there's a very important date in this story, which is the date 1492, and it has nothing to do with Columbus sailing the ocean blue. It has everything to do with a tradition which was preserved in Eastern Christianity from the Jews. There's a Jewish tradition that the world was created in 5008 BC, would be the calculation, and so the 7,000th year of the world's existence would be the year 1492. Now, the idea was that if you think about every day is as 1,000 years, that the 7,000 years was the 7 days of creation. And there was in the Byzantine theology the idea of the 8th day. The 8th day was the day of new creation. So God, the first creation is the 7 days of creation, and the resurrection instigates an 8th day of creation, a new creation. God does something new in the 8th day. So at the end of the 15th century, the power of Byzantium is starting to collapse. Things are starting to go downhill. And at the same time, the power of Moscow is they're starting to push back against the Mongol, against this Tartar yoke. And there's this growing apocalypticism across the Eastern Christian world about the coming of 1492, about the end of time at the beginning of the apocalypse. And as the Turks attack and attack and attack again, the Constantinople, this fear simply grows and grows until two things happen. In 1543, you have the fall of Constantinople. And so in the midst of all of this apocalyptic fear, Constantinople falls, and the Christian Byzantine Roman Empire is finally done for good. And at the same time, you have the growth of this little prince in Moscow named Ivan. We know him as Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan's power is growing as the power of Constantinople wanes. And so this comes with this prophecy. A monk by the name of Saint Philotheus issues this sort of proclamation over the Russian people with the fall of Constantinople. He says, 2 Romes have fallen, the third stands, there will be no fourth. In a sense, Moscow and Ivan are sort of given the mantle of symphonia. They're given the mantle of being the people, being the ones who bring heaven onto earth by encouraging righteousness and by exerting the power of the state. Now, we're going to jump forward. So that's all of our background. We're going to jump forward to the middle of the 19th century when things are not going so well in the Third Rome. They have some universities, but the universities are almost entirely populated by foreigners. There is widespread illiteracy. Over half the population are serfs that have no real freedom or voting power of their own. Things are just not going well in the Third Rome. And there's with this growing sort of sentiment that the answer lies by looking to the West, by looking to Paris or Berlin. And so for instance, if you read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy's novel, which are set about 30 or 40 years after this letter, you hear a lot of people that will just sort of throw out French phrases, for instance. This is how the educated people let you know that they were educated by adopting French customs. And this man who's known as the first Russian philosopher named Chagall writes a letter. So he writes it ostensibly to a single person, but it's meant to be circulated around these salons, these people's houses where they sat, the intellectual class sat and discussed the future of Russia. And then finally, after about 2 years, it was published, and further efforts, the person who published the letter was sent to Siberia, and Chagall was declared insane. And Chagall essentially says, it is one of the most deplorable traits of our strange civilization that we are still discovering truths that are commonplace even among people much less advanced than we. This is because we have never moved in concert with other people. We're not part of any of the great families of the human race. We're neither West nor the East. We have not the traditions of either. We stand, as it were, outside of time. The universal education of mankind has not touched us. Chagall's conclusion is that the only way for there to be a future for Russia is to abandon any idea of there being anything special about Russianness, to abandon the Russian way of life, and to simply adopt, take your pick, either the customs of Germany or of France. It certainly cannot be by continuing to believe that there's anything special about Russia. Now, as you imagine, this split the Russian intelligentsia. A great deal thought that Chagall was absolutely correct, but there began a sort of counter argument to say that there was something particularly different about Russia, about Russian thought and Russian culture that was distinct amongst all of the world's cultures, and it had something distinct to contribute. And in order to see where this argument goes, we're going to need to take a quick look back at the Old Slavonic Bible. Now, this is Romans 1, 16 and 17, or 17 and 18 in Old Church Slavonic. And I have these two words, pravda and istina, underlined here in red and in blue. Pravda is in red and istina is in blue. So I'm going to read the translation in English. In Romans 1:17, for in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as written, the righteous will live by faith. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness, nepravda, not pravda, and the wickedness of people who suppress the truth, istina, by their wickedness. So you see that we have two words here in Old Church Slavonic, that we have righteousness and truth, but through the course of Russian history, these two words came to be kind of synonyms for truth. These were two aspects of truth, but the word pravda became sort of very famously difficult to translate. For instance, there's a letter of a report of a Frenchman who comes in the 1700s to visit Russia, in the middle of the French revolutions, and he says they have no word for justice in Russian, which is not particularly true, but the aspect, let's say, of justice in English and French, which were leading the sort of democratic revolutions in Europe, was not the same as this idea of righteousness, pravda, in Russian. But if you're familiar with history at all, you know the word pravda not from righteousness. You know the word pravda from the Soviet newspaper, right? The newspaper of Stalin, by which he covered over this slaughter of millions of people. How did we get to calling how do we get from Romans 1:17, the righteousness of God, pravda, to the propaganda of Lenin? And so this is a really helpful explanation of pravda. If the czar, the czar the word pravda was associated with the czar and the czar's role in Russian society to enact righteousness in the society, as the person by which a righteous society was sort of hinged on. If the czar acted as the just and righteous czar he was supposed to be, he acted in accordance with pravda. In most dictionaries, the Russian term is usually rendered in English as either justice or truth. In fact, the term belongs among those which are impossible to translate adequately into other, at least Western, languages. The basic idea of the principle is, simply speaking, that there is a preformed order and universal harmony in God's creation, and that this harmony needs to be adequately reflected not only in the divine liturgy, but also in the interhuman relations and in the political order of the community. Now, where have we heard that idea before? We've heard it in the Symphonia, right? This is just the Symphonia translated from the Byzantine emperor into the czar. This is just the czar trying to act as the third Rome, right? That the responsibility of the czar was to mirror the preformed universal harmony of the heavens on earth. And if the czar did it correctly, then the Russian people would thrive. In this view, the czar becomes something like an intermediate personality, a translator of God's will for the benefit of the political system that he presides over. The logic of pravda as truth, is really the logic of genius. It's the logic of genius, the logic of the person that stands between heaven and earth and mediates heaven and earth. One of these philosophers, which led the charge in thinking about the particular contribution of this idea of truth justice, is a man by the name of Nikolai Mikhailevsky. In 1869, so about 30 years after the writing of Chagall's letter, he writes in this essay called "What is Progress?" Every time the word pravda occurs to me, I cannot help marveling at the extraordinary beauty it contains. This word exists, it seems, in no other European language. Only the Russian language appears, designates truth and justice by the same word, so they seem to merge into a grandiose unity. And it's very likely that Lenin named the newspaper Pravda in respect for Mikhailovsky. And the idea of which emerges is essentially the idea that you know the truth by knowing perfection. That, in a sense, if you want to know what the truth is, you have to, if you have in your mind, you sort of have to see up into heaven to see perfection, and then when you see perfection, you can see all of the imperfections in the world around you, and then you can set about fixing all of these imperfections, right? That this is the way by which the truth advances. The truth advances by seeing the perfect society, seeing the utopia, and then seeing injustice in your society in the light of perfect justice, and then working to transform your unjust society into a just society. It is essentially, again, it is the logic of the Symphonia. And this is the logic which leads us from Mikhailovsky directly into Lenin and his murders. And this becomes a theme, actually, in many of Dostoevsky's novels. Dostoevsky in particular, I think two sections. One of them is The Inquisitor. If you haven't read The Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov, it's a chapter. Dostoevsky likes to have these little lectures in the middle of his stories, which he disguises as dialogues. So a very important contribution is The Inquisitor. And this is the second one. This is a little conversation by the main characters, named Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment. And this is what Dostoevsky has his character say. And you can hear Dostoevsky is criticizing in this. He's criticizing Pravda. He's criticizing the idea of the symphonia. Okay? An extraordinary man has the right, that is not an official right, but an inner right, to decide in his own conscious overstep certain obstacles, and only in case it is essential for the practical fulfillment of his idea, sometimes perhaps of benefit to the whole of humanity. I maintain that if the discoveries of Kepler and Newton could not have not been made known except by sacrificing the lives of 1, a dozen, 100, or more men, Newton would have indeed been duty-bound to eliminate the dozen or 100 men for the sake of making his discoveries known to the whole of humanity. In short, I maintain that all great men are even men of little out of common, that is to say, capable of giving some new word, must from their very nature be criminals, more or less, of course. Otherwise, it's hard for them to get out of the common rut. To remain in the common rut is what they can't submit to from their very nature again, and to my mind, they ought to not indeed submit to it. Dostoevsky's vision comes exactly from this. He sees in the Symphonia, in the logic of Pravda, that the transformation, the idolatrous twisting of the incarnation into an idolatrous form. Ruth Coates, in an excellent article, summarizes his thought like this. He says, the God-man, Bogochelovek, that's Christ, the center of the Orthodox faith and the treasure of the Russian people, who is set against the image of the man-God, the all-powerful human pseudo-savior that is the fantasy of the deracinated atheistic social intelligent. The spiritual fate of Russia for Dostoevsky depends upon a choice between the God-man and the man-God. And the idea is this, that Pravda sounds very enticing, but it is predicated on an idea that there's a certain genius, a genius that can stand at the top of the pyramid, and whether that's the Tsar, or whether that's the Emperor and the Patriarch, or whether it's the enlightened philosopher, there's the genius that stands in the top and can see over the gap into the perfection of righteousness, and then can use that as the measuring stick by which to see and therefore fix unrighteousness in his society. But once you believe you're that sort of person, Dostoevsky thinks you've set yourself up to be the man-God. You've set yourself up to be the savior, and then you can then go on to justify what does it matter if I kill a few hundred people or a few thousand people or a few million people if what I get at the end is utopia. Now, we're going to see the revolt against the man-God, the pseudo-savior, that starts to grow sort of underground in the Russian intellectual life, and a lot of it comes from the contribution of this lay theologian, meaning he wasn't a priest, he was a philosopher and a theologian by the name of Alexei Khomiakov. And Khomiakov builds much of his thought around what he's going to form a linguistic distinction around the word Catholic. In Russian, it's going to be the word sobernost. Now, when Methodius and Cyril translated the Greek rite, the religious liturgy into Slavonic, when they translated the creed, instead of transliterating the word Catholic, by Catholic we mean universal, instead of transliterating that Greek word into Russian, they sort of created a neologism, a new word, sobernos. Sober comes from the word for a gathering. So Khomiakov says sober expresses the idea of a gathering, not only in the sense of an actual visible union of many in a given place, but also in the more general sense of the continual possibility of such a union. Okay, so the idea was that when a team gets, let's say a football team gets together, there's the team, which is the team, all of them together. And then let's say there's teamness. There's a teamness that even if they all went to their homes, they're all still part of that team. Now, we very common use the word of spirit to describe this, right? They have a team spirit, and that team binds them together. So they're not just a team when they're playing a game or when they're all together or on the practice field. Even if they're apart, they have the spirit that makes them a team. And Khomiakov says that's the idea of the sobor. It's not the gathering itself, it's the spirit that binds people together. And what exactly is that spirit? And he says it expresses the idea of the unity and multiplicity. So this word sobernos, which is very hard to translate in English, it's typically rendered as a living multi-unity. Multi-unity, meaning a unity of multiple things, a unity not rooted in identity, not rooted in a sameness, a Trinitarian unity, we could say, but it's living. It's rooted in living life, okay? The idea of unity and multiplicity. He goes on, therefore it is obvious that the word katholikos, as understood by the two great servants of the word of God sent by Greece to Slavs, was derived not from kata and ola, but from kata and olan. So what he's saying is that the missionaries understood katholikos not to mean everything, according to everything, that which encompasses all things, but that which is according to what? According to all. According to all, that where you can find the hints of it in all. The true church, Khomiakov says, is the church according to all, according to the unity of all. The church according to free unanimity, according to complete unanimity. The church in which all the peoples have disappeared, in which there are no Greeks, no barbarians, no difference of status, no slave owners, and no slaves. That church about which the Old Testament prophesied, which was realized in the New Testament, in one word, the church, as was defined by St. Paul. And now Khomiakov's observation that's going to be important is his idea that the true church, now Khomiakov universally does not use the language of pravda, he uses the language of istina. So he's sort of reaching into a different understanding of truth. And he's saying in heaven, there is this truth where there is no Greeks, no barbarians, no slave owners. There is a truth of the complete unity of things. That's the istina of heaven, the truth of heaven. And that truth is incarnated in a living multi-unity, but it looks different in earth, in our living multi-unity, than the truth of heaven. There are Greeks and different slave owners and slaves, and there are these things in our real lives. So how do we see the truth from our lived experience? Now, the basis of this difference, I could say, you see in a Kierkegaard essay, which I think is excellent, one of the best essays of the modern period, on the difference between a genius and an apostle. And he points out that what a genius is somebody that essentially sees where things are going. They can look down the pathway and they see way before everywhere else where things are going. That's what a genius is. But Kierkegaard said if St. Paul is regarded as a genius, then things look pretty grim for him. As a genius, St. Paul can't be compared with Plato or Shakespeare. As a corner of beautiful similes, he comes pretty down low on the scale. As a stylist, his name is quite obscure, and as a tent maker, well, frankly, I admit I have no idea how to place him. It is otherwise with an apostle, he says. Apostles are not the same as a genius. An apostle is not born. Apostle is a man called and appointed by God, receiving a mission from him. But this paradoxical fact the apostles made paradoxically different from all other men from all eternity. The new which he may have to bring forth is the essential paradox, okay? So the apostle is different because he's not seeing what's coming. He receives something new. However long it may be proclaimed in the world, it remains essentially and equally new, equally paradoxical, and no eminence can assimilate it. And so what he says, the truth of the church is the truth from the apostles, okay? This is synthesizing Kierkegaard and Khomiakov here. It's an apostolic truth, which means that it never becomes less disruptive. There's never a moment when the Gospels or Exodus or Ecclesiastes or the Psalms should ever stop being anything but new in the life of the church. It is always something new because they weren't just telling us what a human could see, what was down the road. They were bringing something new. In other words, there is no person that can climb to the top of the mountain and can see across the gap. It's received from God. There is no genius when it comes to the truth which the church witnesses to. The way of pravda is always just a way to a pseudo savior. It might sound nice because wouldn't it be nice if if we try to if we try to bring about the truth by caring about justice, by trying to see the perfect world? Wouldn't that be nice? But it always leads to a pseudo savior. So what is Khomiakov's and Kierkegaard's alternative to that? Now, Kierkegaard said, genius is appreciably purely aesthetically. In other words, it calls to us because it sounds nice. According to the measure of its content to specific weight, an apostle what he is through having divine authority. Divine authority is qualitatively a decisive factor. It is not by evaluating the content of the doctrine aesthetically or intellectually that it can reach the result. The very reverse is the case. The man who is called a revelation and to whom a doctrine is entrusted argues from the fact that it's a revelation from his authority. And what Kierkegaard is pointing at here is that the problem is that the things that sound nice to us are very often our own genius. And our own genius very often, almost always, has tragic results. We do not need the things that sound nice to us, that sound like the right way to go to us. We need something new. We need a transformation from above. So here we finally come to the church as one. Written in 1844, this is how it starts. The church is one. Her unity follows of necessity from the unity of God. The unity of the church is trinitariform. The way that the Father, Son, and Spirit are united as one is the way that the church is one. The church is not a multitude of persons in their separate individuality. In other words, when we talk about the church, it's not just formal that we have you have 20 people in the church, and so the church is made up of those 20 people. The church is the spirit that binds those people together. Okay? It's a unity of the grace of God living in a multitude of rational creatures submitting themselves willingly to grace. The church is one, notwithstanding her division as appears to man, who is still alive on earth. It doesn't matter if you look around the Khomiakov and you see a Greek Orthodox church and a Melkite church and a Roman Catholic church and a Presbyterian church. None of that diversity ruins the fact that the church is one, because the church is one because of the oneness of God. Notwithstanding her division as it appears to man, who is still alive on earth, it is only in relation to man that's possible to recognize the division of the church into visible and invisible. Her unity is in reality true and absolute. Why? Because the Spirit of God who lives in the church, ruling and making her wise, manifests himself within her in diverse manners. And here we have the brilliance of Khomiakov's solution. Because he says, what makes the church one? It's because a spirit dwells in the church, in each of her members, and makes her one. However, and this is a theme of much of Russian theology, which is inspired by Khomiakov, the Spirit manifests itself in diverse ways. And so the presence of the Spirit both makes her one and multiplies the diverse ways in which the Spirit manifests the truth through, not by erasing the multiplicity, but by what? A harmony emerging from it. It is the idea of a symphony, but it's now a different idea. What brings unity to a symphony? It's the music. And it doesn't matter that the horn and the viola and the harpsichord are playing different things. That's what makes it a symphony, right? It is not that there is no principle of unity, that people can play whatever, but it is that there is a music. The music is what brings unity from the different modes of hearing the same music. And there is actually not an improvement in a symphony if everybody plays the exact same notes. The beauty of the music emerges through this unity of diversity. The grace of faith, Khomiakov says, is not to be separated from holiness of life. In other words, we can't abstract away the church out of real life. We don't receive it from some sort of heavenly vision, nor can any single community or any single pastor be acknowledged to be the custodian of the whole faith of the church. You could read this sort of as a warning against, I am of Luther and I am of Calvin and I am of, this theologian or that, right? No single person, no single church is the custodian of the whole faith, any more than any single community or any single teacher can be looked upon as a representative of the whole of our sanctity. And here's where he makes his turn. The church is one, holy, sobernost, apostolic, because it is one, holy, because it belongs to the whole world and not to some locality, because all mankind and the whole earth are sanctified by it, not to some one people or country, because its essence consists in the agreement and unity of spirit and life of all of its members throughout the whole earth, recognizing the Spirit of God who lives in the church, ruling her and making her wise, manifests herself within her in diverse manners. So this is where he makes his turn to the idea of sobernost. The church is a living multi-unity. And out of that living multi-unity, in our different ways of seeing what it means for us to pursue the Christian faith, there comes the evidence for the common possession of the Spirit. Now, that's really difficult because it's not always easy to see. If you go and you visit a Russian Orthodox church and you go to an evangelical church somewhere in the United States, right? And then you go to a Shimbe Baptist church among the Zulu, right? It's not obvious how all of these things are all part of the same church. And I don't believe Khomiakov is saying that all expressions of Christianity, in fact, I think he's clearly not saying, if you read this, that all expressions of Christianity are equal. But what he's saying is that the way to make it more truthful is not to eliminate the diversity. And in fact, time and time again, Christianity has planted the message in new places, and what's grown is another facet of the gospel. The beauty of a diamond is not enhanced by collapsing it into one facet. When you add a new facet to the diamond, its beauty is enhanced. And so the trick of the church is not to climb the ladder of genius and see the realm of perfection, but rather to discern the dwelling of the Spirit in the church, to see the unity of the church, to hear the music, and then together as a loving community to try to tune all of our music, to our instruments, to the same music. And this theme of love is exactly what he picks up. And he spends much of the rest of his career explicating some of these ideas. Unfortunately, almost none of Khomiakov's work are translated into English. It's all still mostly in Russian. Here's one essay that he writes in 1857. Love is not a tendency towards unification. In other words, the direction of love is not to make everything uniform. It requires, it seeks, it creates, responds, and contacts. Love itself grows and is strengthened and perfected through these responses and communication. Love plants itself in other soils, and then through communication and the response that it receives, that's how love grows, both what is planted and grows itself. The highest knowledge of truth is beyond the reach of an isolated mind. It is open only to a society of minds bound together by love. Truth looks as though it were the achievement of a few, but in reality is the creation and possession of all. The oneness of the church is accomplished by the church as we love our neighbors, as we love the church, loving the church, even when that's difficult and we don't always understand what that means. That is how the truth advances, not by the achievements of a few, but by the loving communion of many. He says this idea sharply distinguishes Orthodox teaching from all others. Latinism, which rests on external authority, that we need one institute, that a unity through institutions, let's say, and Protestantism, which liberates the persons in the desert of rationalistic abstractions. I'd say that would be maybe the tyranny of the genius. What is said about the highest truth applies also to philosophy. Through love, there is not idle speculation, but actual creation of thought and of all things. What's interesting here is that Khomiakov in some ways is claiming that Russia has saved Byzantine theology from Symphonia. It saved it by the planting that idea in a new soil, and in that new soil grew a better version of what was planted, in the sense that it was not the Byzantine theology that came to it that ended up being superior. It was that which grew within the Russian soil, which is a really interesting idea. The church is not authority, he says, just as God is not authority. Now that's weird. Isn't God our authority? And what Khomiakov is arguing is that the relationship of God within the Trinity is not a relationship of authority. Therefore, we should not conceive of God's relationship to us primarily through the lens of authority. God is not authority, Christ is not authority, because authority is something external to us. That's the vision where we climb the mountain and see something external to us. He says rather that we encounter the Spirit of God within us, and we count it in finite forms and in flawed forms, but when we love each other, the Spirit of God comes together into its full beauty so we can begin to see what it truly is. We can see the truth. Not authority, I say, but truth, and at the same time, the life of a Christian is inner life. For God, Christ, the church, live in him a life which is more real than the heart which beats in his breast, or the blood which flows in his veins, but they live in him only as much as he himself lives an ecumenical life of love and unity, that is the life of the church. I'm just going to end with a thought from another Russian Orthodox theologian by the name of Alexander Schmemann. Now, Khomiakov says, before we get there, he says, the world is a creation. It's a divine thought that represents a complete and perfect harmony and beauty and joy. A spirit that violates the law of divine truth and righteousness puts himself in a state of hostility towards the divine thought, towards harmony of cosmic life, and therefore bound to suffer. In other words, if you make yourself the pseudo-savior, you're going to trample on the things that God has made good, and woe to you if you do that. We're going to end here, this little essay by a Russian Orthodox theologian, which comes out of this strand from Khomiakov. He's influenced by Khomiakov and the people that Khomiakov instructed, by the name of Alexander Schmemann. He taught here in the U.S. After growing up in France, his family was expelled from the Soviet Union. This is a great essay called Between Escape and Utopia. And this is his understanding of how does the church, when it's met with all the problems in the world and all the differences of opinions, how do we not begin to trample upon the world, to despiritualize it in the name of trying to instigate our visions of righteousness, but trying to set up our utopias. And this is what he says. We're going to end here. This is what the Christian always was able to find in the very acts by which the church was defined. One was the proclamation of the good news, Evangelion, and the other was the sacrament of thanksgiving, the great Eucharistia, thanksgiving, which teaches us this. You want to understand what something is. Of course, you can buy a dictionary, or you can buy an encyclopedia. You want to know what the human body is? Buy, of course, a book of anatomy. But if you really want to know what anything in this world is, start by thanking God for it. Then you will not fall into the heresy of reducing. The person who finds the truth is not saying to God, I'm entitled to it. It's my constitutional right to always have this or that. It is the man who, by thanking God, all of a sudden exclaims, heaven and earth are full of thy glory. By doing this, we would be active participants in the constant process of saving the world which God has created, the world which has fallen, the world which is being redeemed by those who believe in redemption. If you want to know how the church is won, begin by believing that the world can be saved, and that the world can be saved by God transforming it. And if you want to begin to be the sort of people that can do that, begin by thanking God. Thank God for the things, for the diversity in the world. Thank God for the people that we don't understand, whose opinions that we might find insane. And if we begin by thanking God that His Spirit's active in the world, Schmemann, Khomiakov, Kierkegaard, We said we can be saved from becoming the pseudo saviors we don't want to be, and it's just possible that we might get to participate in God's redemption of the world as we want to.